This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. If you follow Democratic politics at all, you've probably heard some version of this argument. After the 2024 loss, Democrats need to move to the center. Tone down the cultural messaging, talk less about identity and diversity, focus relentlessly on economic concerns, win back moderates. One of the most discussed documents making that case is a post-election report called Deciding to Win. It's serious, it's data-driven, and it argues that Democrats have lost persuadable voters because they're perceived as culturally out of step and overly focused on issues that don't resonate with the middle of the electorate. And to be fair, this isn't some fringe idea. We've had thoughtful guests on this show make versions of that same recommendation. Political scientists, strategists, pollsters, people I respect. The argument has weight behind it. But here's a question many are wrestling with. What if the entire move to the center framework is built on an outdated model of how voters actually think? What if voters aren't sorting themselves neatly along left-right lines the way political professionals assume? And what if the problem isn't that Democrats are too progressive, but that voters don't actually know what Democrats stand for beyond a handful of cultural signifiers? And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today's guest is the perfect expert to discuss this topic.
I'm Frank Spring. I'm the Chief of Research at Altum Insight and the Managing Partner at Undaunted Ventures. I'm a narrative consultant, and that's what led me to both. I come out of campaign world originally, and my focus is on how we use the behavioral psychology and cognitive neuroscience of story to help understand the stories that people are telling themselves. That's what I do at Altum, and to help advocates, especially candidates for office, tell their own story in a way that is clear and compelling. That's what I do at Undaunted Ventures.
Frank A. Spring has been conducting deep qualitative research, long-form narrative interviews with voters across the country, not quick horse race polling, not message testing in isolation, but sustained conversations about identity, values, and lived experience. And what he's finding complicates the dominant story. This isn't about giving Democrats advice. That's not what this show is for. It's about interrogating the assumptions that drive our political narratives and asking whether we're even diagnosing the problem correctly. Let's get into it. This narrative that the Democratic Party is kind of too far left, I've heard that outside the Deciding to Win framework, particularly from political scientists often that kind of talk about that, and others as well. I've been wanting to have this conversation with somebody for a while, and it's and nobody's wanted to have it. I'm not really here to give Democrats advice, but it's still an important part of our political landscape right now of these kind of questions.
Sure. The idea of whether the Democratic Party is too left or too right, or whether the Republican Party is too left or too right, that frame is superannuated. It's old, it's outdated, it doesn't really work anymore. What we're seeing is that people are a lot more politically heterodox than we might expect, and that an assumption that left on social issues, right on social issues, left on economy, right on economy, that if that frame ever really described how people make decisions, it doesn't work anymore. And that came through very clearly, and particularly in what we saw last year.
The dominant advice after Democratic losses is simple. Move toward the center. But what if that framework is outdated? What if voters aren't thinking in left-right terms at all?
We did a study of Gen Z Latinos in the West, especially in Arizona, and we posed them a series of questions in which we asked the big question was, what is government for? That was the umbrella question, and then within that we would ask them around a series of sort of technically policy areas, housing and education and a few others, but mostly housing. This group was particularly concerned about housing. We saw that very early on, and they had a deep-rooted worry about being able to afford a house when they got older, and there was a lot of anxiety about we got a sense that there was a difficulty seeing having a place for themselves in the future, a place for the people that they care about. In many of them, there's a real sense of shame that they were not living up to the living standard of their parents, many of whom were immigrants to this country. And so the idea is, well, they did this, why can't I? So we were so housing, we hit that one particularly hard. But what we would do is we would ask them, what is government for and what should government do about this problem? And then we would pose them 3 or 4 different policy options, but the point was not to say, oh, they like this policy option more than that policy option. We didn't ask them to pick their favorite. It was just, what would you say if we did this? What would you think if government did this? How would you feel about government doing this? And what the point about all of the options that we presented on every policy area was, one of them was, at least one of them had to be quite what we would consider traditionally left wing, so spending a lot of government money. And one of them was sort of needed to be a little bit more kind of moderate. So, there's some government expenditure, but it's moderated in some way. Then the last one was a free market answer. And where possible, would also offer options that were, government with its hands off and government with its hands on. So, we were sort of testing appetite for spending and regulation, which we sort of see as being the two things that would sort of constitute a more left of center approach, versus not spending, not taxing, and not regulating at all. The government not getting very much involved in your life. So there's really a question of, what do you think about whether or not the government should spend money, and how involved do you think the government should be in things? And what we found was the answers were absurdly heterodox. We had Republicans telling us, yes, I think the government should fund down payment gifts to people buying their first homes. Failing that, they should give low or no interest loans to people buying their first homes, and also the federal government should cap housing prices in certain zip codes, which is an absurdly interventionist approach to economics that, and again, these were Republicans. Democrats agreed with that as well. But we had Democrats telling us that it was on gun control, telling us that it was impossible to regulate, they shouldn't even try to regulate the sale of assault rifles, but they and independents and Republicans all said, but there should be mandatory federal psychological testing if you're going to buy a certain type of weapon, which is the sort of thing that would have made the John Birch Society faint away. So their views were, you could say they were remarkably inconsistent, but there was a very profound consistency to them. And that was a sense that politics was not working. And they were less interested in drawing lines, left and right on methodology than they were in someone doing something that worked. That was very clear to them. So that is, and we saw that kind of heterodoxy all over the country. I just remember those Republican kids telling me that the government needed to cap the price of housing, by fiat, and needed to give people money for down payments, which is a position that I think would have made Republicans, certainly of the Mitt Romney stripe, just faint dead away. And that did not bother them at all. And Democrats likewise held fairly what we consider conservative positions in other areas. So their heterodoxy is the order of the day. I think those old kind of party identification lines are beginning to break down.
If voters don't sort themselves neatly along ideological lines, then move to the center may be solving the wrong problem.
There is a sort of school of thought within the Democratic Party that Democrats talk too much about what are sometimes called social issues, right? That we talk too much about diversity or inclusivity, DEI, and that drives people away, and that comes at a cost to our ability to communicate with communicate with people and to build relationships with undecided voters. What we did find that, and we found this very consistently. This was truest among the young people, among Gen Z, but this was true across every panel that we did every study that we did last year, and everything we've seen this year. That people have a very clear notion that the Democratic Party is for diversity, right? They know this. When we ask, what do you associate with the Democratic Party, and we've asked them to, bring together various pictures or record videos talking about this and to bring words and so forth. It was all around diversity. Democrats are for diversity. And the thing is, almost no one objected to that. We only found a few really rooted, diehard Republicans who really had some objection to that. But even within the people with intact conservative political identities that we were talking to, for the most part, they actually didn't think that was too offensive. Everyone was pretty much on board with it. The problem is they didn't know what else the party was for.
So the issue may not be that Democrats are too progressive. It may be that voters can't describe what Democrats actually stand for.
One of the ads that we tested was the infamous, "She's for Them" ad, the profoundly anti-trans ad that the Republican Party ran a lot of in 2024. Spent $275 million on ad buys for that thing. What we found in our panels over and over again was even Republicans found the tone of that ad bullying and cruel, and they really did not land. The idea that the idea that there is something that you can kind of make political hay, that there is some political virtue in taking an anti-trans position. You see that pop up in Democratic circles less and less as as pro-trans, pro-rights, pro-civil rights candidates keep winning elections, including very famously and most recently Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, absolutely hammered on this issue by Republicans all cycle long and cruised to victory. So did so did Mickey Sherrill. So Democrats were not in the least bit burdened by any positive thing they've ever said about basic human and civil rights for trans people, and yet we have been told over and over again by people in my political class that this is really this is an anchor around the Democratic Party that we should get rid of, and there's just never been any evidence for it, and there's never been any sort of, to borrow a phrase, there's never been a mechanistic explanation for why that would be the case, for why a large number of independent voters, of people who didn't already have really strong, intact conservative narratives, why they would be so motivated by that one issue to cast their ballot on that basis. There's never been an explanation for it, and there's never been an explanation in the data. It's just a myth.
If social issues weren't the deciding factor, then the move to the center argument starts to look less like strategy and more like panic.
But we've got to get someone in there who understands business. There was a sense, I think, with voters that something is rattling under the hood of the economy, that people's fortune, it's too expensive to live, and you're not paid enough to make it. But mostly that it's gotten too expensive to live, and that we need someone who understands business who can get this in. And Trump has spent decades presenting himself as the business guy, the guy who knows dollars and cents. It's not true, of course. The guy lost money running a casino. One of the things that is worth sort of tracking is the classic question, which I think is done by Pew: should government do more, or is government doing too much? And traditionally, since the Reagan era, we have seen that number. That's very consistently the view has been government does too much and shouldn't do so much. That's kind of the basis of the Reagan political compact. That number in the last few years has flipped, and the trajectory is going up. More and more Americans are saying government should do more. This does not necessarily mean that you need to adopt Bernie Sanders' policy position wholesale, but I think if the sort of natural instinct is, should government take a greater role? And again, we saw this. The thing that we saw most consistently, again, with the political heterodoxy of our panels last year, was people being, not always, but substantially in favor of government interventions in ways that are both liberal and illiberal. The sort of classic American, the left, as represented by Bernie Sanders, has a little bit made the same mistake that the kind of center has made in terms of understanding how voters make decisions, which again is that voters are the decision to vote itself, the decision to participate in politics, and then to form a political identity and express that identity through how you vote, is a much more complex process than a simple analysis of material politics. Material politics is a really important part of it, but that's not what's going to get people to vote for you. The thing that matters is, what does it feel like to live in the country that you govern? And this is where Mamdani was so extraordinary. And we can debate about whether if you ran him in other parts of the country he'd win. I think he probably would, to be honest with you. But the core of his campaign, and I do want to take a second just to do a little story on that. The core of his campaign, back when he was polling below 1%, when no one had any idea who he was, right after, and even before the whole thing really began, right after the election, he was going out on the streets of New York, and he had a camera, and he was just interviewing people at subway stops. Hey, what do you think about politics? What do you think about this election? He was doing his own kind of impromptu political ethnography, asking people for these vox pops on the street. And what they said substantially informed a lot of the way he thought about this race. And there's one woman in one line that I think really kind of, to understand where his race came from and why it was so successful, you have to go back to this woman who said, "I used to love New York, and now it's just a place I live." And Mamdani took that and he flipped it. The whole campaign was about loving New York again. All right, how does it feel to live in New York? How does it feel to live in Mamdani's New York? It feels good, man. It feels good because you can afford stuff. You can get the price, your halal doesn't cost $11 that you have for lunch. It costs $8 now. And, you can go to a grocery store that works, and you can get on the bus and ride anywhere without having to pay for it. All right, all of this stuff was in the sense of the possibility, and it was a joyful experience. And while Mamdani's story has very clear villains, including Donald Trump and billionaires and Andrew Cuomo, for the most part, it was really positive. Look at what we're going to build together. And I think to the extent that, and I don't disagree with Bernie Sanders' analysis in a substantial way, but most of his story was and could be often bogged down in being critical, understandably, but being very critical of the powerful special interests that have done this to us. He really had a very harsh and a very villain-centric story. The agency is all with the powerful special interests, the billionaires, the wealthy elite who have done this to us. Not saying he was wrong, but what does it feel like to live in Bernie Sanders' America is a different question than what does it feel like to live in Zoran Mamdani's America or AOC's America, where you have this much more sort of positive version of like, this is, all of the, government expenditure, leftist politics in service of what? What does it feel like to live here? Does everyone have a place in this country? And I think the center of the party is at least as guilty as being overly cognitive in the way that it approaches talking to voters, at least as guilty as the left, if not more. And again, the whole assumption there is, well, if we just present the right policy position with the right slogan attached to it, people are going to vote for us. That's not it. You're trying to conjure values. You're trying to conjure identity. That's a much deeper process.
If voters aren't asking whether Democrats are too far left, maybe Democrats shouldn't be either. Maybe the question isn't how far to move, but whether they've told a coherent story at all. We started with a familiar argument. Democrats need to move to the center. The Decided to Win report puts that case in serious, data-driven terms. And again, this isn't a fringe position. We've had smart, credible guests on this show who've made versions of that same recommendation. But what Frank's research suggests is something more complicated. It's not that voters are demanding ideological moderation in some clean left versus right sense. Many voters don't experience politics that way anymore. They're economically anxious, yes. They're distrustful of institutions, for sure. They're frustrated. But they don't line up neatly along partisan frameworks. And in many cases, they don't see Democrats as too extreme. They just don't know what Democrats are for. That's a very different diagnosis. If the problem is ideological excess, then the prescription is triangulation. But if the problem is narrative confusion, if voters can't articulate what a party stands for beyond a few cultural signals, then the solution isn't moving left or right. It's clarity. It's coherence. It's telling a story about what life actually feels like under your vision of governance. And zooming out even further, this is where it intersects with what we talk about on this show all the time. When our political discourse reduces everything to too far left or too far right, it simplifies a much messier reality. It turns structural distrust into culture war shorthand. It turns voter frustration into ideological caricature. And maybe that's part of the outrage machine at work. So whether you agree with the move to center thesis or not, the deeper question might be this. Are we even asking the right question? Not how far left or right a party should go, but do voters feel understood? Do they feel respected? Do they feel that they have agency? And can they actually describe what a party stands for in human terms? That's a harder conversation, but probably a more useful one. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you'd like to listen to the full interview with Frank A. Spring, you can find that on our YouTube channel. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.